Ladies, gentlemen, and tarnished of all ages, in the base game of Elden Ring, one of the more interesting new things to play around with was the sleep status. You can apply this in a few different ways, but it was quite the unique status to make builds around or play around either in PvE or in PvP scenarios as well. In Shadow of the Erdtree, the DLC for the game, we got the addition of what is essentially just a more commanding and powerful version of the status, which is called Eternal Sleep. So today, like we did with normal sleep in the base game, we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive and some testing to see exactly what Eternal Sleep is, what it does, and we'll check it out against a number of different enemies as well as every remembrance boss in the DLC to see if it is actually worth using properly. Eternal Sleep then is specifically only available through a few methods. There are Eternal Sleep throwing pots and things like that, but if you really wanted to work around a proper Eternal Sleep type build, you would want either the Velvet Sword of St. Trina, which is down in the Fissure area by the Fissure Cross site of Grace, Tholier's Hidden Needle, which is the reward for finishing his questline at the end of the game, or tertiarily, Eternal Sleep Grease, which has a cookbook for infinite crafting that you can find right here, east of the fissure on top of the hill down here in the Cerulean Coast, south side of the area. And the unique flower for crafting these as well are all around the exact same place. After testing these methods against each other, I found the fist weapons to be the worst at applying Eternal Sleep of the ones you would properly use at least. They just had low enough buildup that with actual weapon upgrades, it would probably kill pretty much anything before actually applying the debuff, which makes it sort of pointless. But then the other two are actually surprisingly close. The Velvet Sword of St. Trina's main method of application is actually the unique skill, Mists of Eternal Slumber, which both has a lot of buildup on the hit of the skill itself, but also coats your weapon in bonus Eternal Sleep juice on top of the base amount that's on the weapon. While coated, this takes 3 hits to put a Horned Warrior enemy into Eternal Sleep state. The Ripple Crescent Halberd is a special weapon from the base game, which has incredibly high base arcane scaling and being able to have greases applied to it as well. Importantly, in the base game, this included Sleep Grease, and this was generally the best way to actually apply sleep in melee range, because sleep buildup from grease, when on a weapon with arcane scaling, will scale with your arcane. The same seems to apply to Eternal Sleep Grease with this weapon specifically. However, they also seem to have realized this beforehand, as even with this applied and the sleep status soft cap of arcane, it is 3 hits from this weapon to apply Eternal Sleep to the same enemy, so exactly the same as a buffed Velvet Sword of St. Trina. Generally speaking then, if your goal is purely Eternal Sleep buildup and nothing else, 2 Ripple Crescent Halberds with a pile of grease isn't the worst. Not to mention that you can also give yourself things like the Rotten Wing Sword or other multi-hit bonuses, so you can take advantage of the Eternal Sleep with multi-hit attacks while power stancing the weapons and just build this up a lot in the free stun that you get. But you can achieve quite a similar amount of buildup with just the Velvet Sword of St. Trina, which also gives you the unique skill with higher buildup rate whenever you get the actual large enough openings to use it. As well, unlike the Halberds, these have the exact same Eternal Sleep buildup regardless of any of your stats and regardless of weapon upgrade level as well, which means that you can use the Velvet Sword of St. Trina as like an offhand or a secondary weapon that you swap to just for the purpose of Eternal Sleep with absolutely minimal investment in your build. That said, with this, I then started just applying Eternal Sleep to anything and everything to see what would happen. Like base sleep, there are 4 stages of interactions with Eternal Sleep. The majority of random little enemies in the game, but even some more mini-boss types like Albinauric Wolf Riders, as an example, can be put to sleep using this debuff literally eternally, as the name says. I sat beside this little guy after putting him to sleep for about 10 minutes, just to see if there was some sort of excruciatingly long timer that I might trigger if I waited long enough before I got bored, and then punched him to death because he just wasn't getting up. Because this Eternal Sleep is exactly what it says on the tin. Then there is the first stage of resistance to Eternal Sleep. The way this applies then is somewhat hit and miss. There's no hard fast rule of which enemies this will be on unless you try it, but this version of Eternal Sleep will make an enemy fall over, completely vulnerable to being hit for about 8 seconds or so, without worry of breaking the stun even if you are hitting them. Then if you attack past that, they will instantly stand up. Otherwise, if you wait a second after this little barrier here, they will get a crit spot that appears on their normal crit place, and if you do that, that too will wake them up. If you do nothing after applying the status to these specific enemies, they will wake back up after 60 seconds of being left alone. For comparison, this same Frost Troll from the base game, when having normal sleep buildup applied to it, will fall on his face with a crit spot and get up in about 2 seconds very, very quickly. So it is a significantly bigger window of free damage, and you can get a lot of free weapon hits before even getting the crit that you also still get from Eternal Sleep. Notable enemies that this applies to in the DLC from my testing are the Demi-Human Queen boss that is in the Cerulean Coast, as well as both of the Great Red Bear field bosses, who lose every ounce of difficulty if you put them to sleep for 10 seconds, and then just whack them with an upgraded weapon before getting your free crit. Then there is Stage 2 resistance. This is what the majority of meaningful non-boss enemies will have, and this is also how Eternal Sleep functions against players in PvP, or against things like invasion NPCs in the game, which it stuns for right around 3 seconds. With normal sleep, if you apply to this type of resistance of enemies, they will get stunned for 3 seconds just the same, but if you hit them again during this window, they will immediately be able to move again, they'll be able to roll, they'll be able to just avoid attacks. However, with Eternal Sleep, even if you spam roll as somebody who has this applied, you as I was saying, even if you spam roll as somebody who's being applied with Eternal Sleep, you actually cannot get out for the full 3-second stun duration, even if you are being constantly attacked. This applies to things like the Horned Warrior enemies, the Fire Knights, though they weirdly have incredibly high sleep resistance, so it takes a lot of build-up on them, and importantly, as far as bosses go, Rolana, the Twin Moon Knight, also is affected by this stage of Eternal Sleep, and her resistance is actually quite low, so the build-up is relatively fast, making her the only DLC Remembrance boss where Eternal Sleep is actually arguably quite useful. Then we have the final one, Stage 3 Resistance, and this is essentially just immunity to Eternal Sleep. No reactions at all, or it takes such an insane amount to build up for such little result that it may as well just be full immunity. This, unfortunately, applies to literally every Remembrance boss in the DLC who is not Rolana. I tried beating up every single one with a mix of the Velvet Sword of St. Trina and the Eternal Sleep Greased Halberds. Even the final boss, I got to hit a fairly frequent amount in the first phase, and not a single one of them even considered taking a nap even for a moment. I checked every one of these, every single one, even Bayle the Dread, who technically isn't a Remembrance boss, and no sleep at all. Curse you, Bayle! So basically, to round up all of my findings in a nice little bow, Eternal Sleep is extremely powerful against the things that it does work against. Whether it be the permanent sleep on littler enemies, the up to 8 seconds of free damage and then the free crit proc on every Stage 1 resist enemy, or even 3 seconds of free damage against something like Rolana is honestly pretty damn strong if it applies. However, it is a damn shame that you get none of that for 10 out of 11 of the important bosses in the DLC, and even the stronger versions of the effect are quite rare on the field bosses too, as even something as basic as Bloodfiend Chief, for example, is seemingly similarly just completely immune to Eternal Sleep. The places that this status is best by far is against players in PvP if you can manage to get enough build-up on them, against NPC type fights, against smaller enemies, and level clearing where you can literally just tell the trash to take a timeout, and even against a fair number of mini-bosses, but it gets extremely hit or miss on anything with a boss health bar, with a lot more misses than hits, unfortunately. The one saving grace, sort of, is because the Velvet Sword of St. Trina doesn't require much investment to actually build. If you are going against something that happens to be particularly weak to it, you can just whip it onto whatever build you're using, and as long as you have the stat requirements, it'll be just as good as it needs to be. Eternal Sleep simply is great when it applies, it just doesn't apply to the vast majority of meaningful enemies, and that's the crux of it, really. That just about does it for today then, everyone. Just a bit of a deeper dive and investigation into Eternal Sleep as one of the rarest statuses in the game, with only a few ways to apply it. Some interestingly extremely strong uses when it works, but these are very few and far between. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video then, and hopefully it's given you a bit of insight into this new status variation in the expansion. Like if you liked the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.